Okay, this is the August 21st, 2019 meeting of SIG Auth. The first item on the agenda is the policy working group update. Erica, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I don't have a formal presentation or anything. I hope that's
no,
okay.
That's totally fine.
So it's been a pretty moderate amount of here for, if anyone's unfamiliar, is our working group meeting notes. We meet every other Wednesday at this point at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So there's a couple of larger efforts that are ongoing that we've been working on. Number one is formal methods for verifying policies in Kubernetes. The idea here is we can't necessarily control the policy sprawl, but can we use some methods to understand them better and give guarantees on top of that. Here it is. I'll link to the larger kind of discussion PR that goes across the SIG security and the CNCF. We've kind of narrowed down sort of what makes sense for it, and we're looking for kind of POC from different members of the community. Then another effort, we kind of keep tabs on the open policy agent. That's big. I think it's been good. We hear more and more every day about it. So one interesting thing, or thing that might be of relevance to this SIG in particular, was the Gatekeeper, which is a sub-project of the open policy agent, specifically for running on Kubernetes, kind of did some POCs of what would it mean to replace pod security policies with something like Gatekeeper. So they added kind of some constraints in the libraries and to kind of cover some of the aspects. If you'd like to look at what it would mean, what kind of policies and what they would look like to have similar sort of coverage as what we have in Kubernetes at the moment. I think those are the main things that would be of interest this summer. Of course, there's also a multi-tenancy group who have ongoing work we kind of keep tabs on. But for right now, those are our main things. Does anyone have questions I can answer?
So go ahead, Tim.
One thing that I've been thinking about and chatting with the Gatekeeper team about a little bit is sort of the workflow around actually rolling out policies and also requesting exceptions. I think in a large organization, it's sort of unrealistic to simply push out a new enforcing policy across the whole organization. And so we've sort of been talking a little about this idea of what it would look like to either request a temporary exception while a team were to fix a policy or to fix their code to meet a policy, or a permanent exception for something like a system daemon set. Has the working group kind of talked about the workflow or the rollout process at all?
For Gatekeeper in particular?
Or just in general. I think this is a general problem that isn't really addressed by any of the existing policy mechanisms we have built in.
Yeah, I don't think we have talked too much about that, except so much as what kind of we were looking at. Do we understand what policies effects will actually have? So that was one aspect you're looking at is, yeah, do we know what this really means. I know that like Gatekeeper recently added dry run, which is sort of the dry runs or kind of audit only is sort of the easy way from a technical perspective to deal with that. So I think definitely an interesting, good idea would be to kind of audit well, which policies don't in Kubernetes right now don't have that kind of functionality to allow for audit only.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
I think it also depends on what's being enforced. If it's enforcement of policy set, then it's sometimes okay to add the enforcement, know what policies already existed that are violating the meta policy, and then go and remove them. But for something like authorization, I think it's difficult to turn on something like this team, only this team can access resources in this namespace. That policy is breaking if it isn't a meta policy that applies to RBAC rule or RBAC role creation or RBAC role binding creation. So I think it's sometimes okay to break policy on policy, but generally difficult to break policy on runtime enforcement with these type of rollouts. I'm interested to hear more about the PSP replacement. What are the plans for that? Because that's something that has come up pretty frequently.
Yeah, I think we didn't have necessarily planned so much as, okay, we've heard a lot about this, about people wondering what's the future. So I think, step one was, okay, well, what would it even look like to use something like this? Is this even possible? Or are there things that would need to be done in one place or the other? Or what is the experience kind of like? So that was what the constraint library was kind of looking at was, first of all, okay, what does it look like to even do this? Step two, okay, does that mean this is the direction we would like to move or push people?
Is the idea to use something like OPA, which is out of Kubernetes, or is the idea to build something similar to OPA within core Kubernetes?
Somewhere in between is what Gatekeeper is, sort of somewhere in between, where it's sort of an extension that you use, using like admission webhooks and other kind of Kubernetes features. That is natively run for Kubernetes, but utilizes Rego and OPA to help define and enforce the policies.
If so, the first pass is going to be close to an API compatible replacement, and then it's going to be in a state where we can iterate on it and change the Rego and move the API towards something that we actually think is useful.
I don't think that a Gatekeeper constraint will ever be a total dropping replacement for pod security policy, because the semantics of how constraints are applied is a little different. Pod security policy is sort of like, by default, nothing is allowed, and any policy that you match is allowed. Gatekeeper constraints are sort of the inverse of that, where it's by default everything is allowed, and I don't know if the PSP one is applied kind of completely or if it's sort of layered on, but in any case, you can only kind of tighten restrictions, I believe. So
Yeah.
there will be some differences there, and we'll have to think a little about the migration path if we.
What is the main motivation here? Is it because PSP is not generic enough, or?
I think the motivation is that PSPs are in a very weird in-between state where they need more work to be moved to GA, but have some kind of usability quirks that make it the future of where we should go with them unclear. At the same time, OPA and things like this are coming up in the ecosystem that supply a lot of the same functionality. I think that was kind of the motivation. I can find the issue in Kubernetes.
I think what Tim cited earlier in his presentation a couple meetings ago was bad authorization model, inability to roll out, and bad API. That's sort of the three notes that I took away from it. It's unfortunately at this time, PSP has a ton of users, and it's currently in perma beta. And while we have some major, have identified pretty major issues with the current PSP, it's hard to evolve in backwards incompatible ways. And it doesn't seem at this time like something that we would really want to take to GA. Is that kind of your take, Tim?
Yeah, I think that's a good description of the problems with pod security policy. There's this sort of bigger meta question of like what policies belong in Kubernetes core or kind of shipped by default with Kubernetes. And I think the direction a lot of us are leaning in is that it's too hard to come up with like a small set of policies that are like should be generically applied or kind of meet all of the needs of a majority of users. What we've kind of found is that most users have some sort of specific cases that they need policies for, and so you end up having to mix these built-in mechanisms like pod security policy with some kind of third-party add-on kind of thing like OPA. And then you end up having to manage these two policies in different systems that don't necessarily like compose well together, and you need different tooling around rollouts and management of the two different policy mechanisms. And so one of the ideas behind kind of moving towards a more generic framework like OPA or Gatekeeper is you can have this one mechanism that covers almost all policy needs and can be sort of uniform across those different needs. Mike, you're somehow muted, I think. Hardware muted, maybe. Still can't hear you.
How about now?
Great.
All right, sorry about that. But it does seem clear like we're gonna have to support PSP for a fairly long deprecation window. So anything that we can do to start that deprecation, which means having a decent replacement, is helpful. And we're looking at, I think we brought up the OpenShift security context constraints, or something like the Gatekeeper PSP implementation as a potential target for people migrating off PSP if we do eventually decide to remove it.
Mm-hmm. If there aren't any other questions for Erica, I wanted to finish off with asking if there's any ways that you think the SIG Auth community can better support the policy working group or vice versa, or if there's ways that we can sort of improve our cross-team communication.
Definitely, I think I will make a note to come to SIG Auth and check in more regularly. I'm sure that will help. The other, sorry, getting some echoes. The other things, of course, if people, the more people I think who engage and try out these different methods or kind of bring forward what they're feeling, that always kind of helps out. And the other thing is if you have kind of priorities or things that you want that become like higher priority to as part of your roadmap, definitely let us know so that we can prioritize appropriately.
Cool, thank you for the update. Agenda's a little light today. Last thing, unless anybody has something else that they want to bring up, is issues.
Before we go on to issues, I just wanted to mention that discussions on the security process working group are still ongoing. I haven't had a chance to follow up too much on that this past 2 weeks, but hoping to push more on that. I think the big open question around that working group right now is whether we want to kind of fold some of that into SIG Auth, or if it makes sense to have a standalone working group. Yeah, stay tuned. If you have thoughts, feel free to join in the discussion on that document.
All right. I'm having AV problems today. However, is everybody able to see my screen?
We see two screens. We have the doc and the, there we go.
Beautiful, thank you. Whoa. Only one new issue. So this is unprioritized. Tim, manage CA certs. So I think the idea here is that we have a bunch of people who bake in CA certificates into their Docker images in order to connect to outside services, public services. We don't have very good facilities for managing shared CA certificates as config maps. Mostly, I think one of the big problems is you don't have cross namespace config maps or global config maps. And we don't have a lot of tooling for managing these bundles.
Yeah, this is partly motivated because building the CA certs into the Docker images seems like a anti-pattern. You end up, especially if you have different base images running in your cluster, you end up with potentially different sets of trusted CA certs. And so the idea is to kind of manage that centrally and have a consistent set of CA certs across all pods in the cluster. Yeah, it's kind of config maps would be an obvious way of doing this, but we don't have cross namespace config maps right now.
This is probably something that deserves a small cap, maybe.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that, yeah, freeze the life cycle and call this backlog.
I haven't been keeping up with API machinery yet. I don't think there's any tests or anything for clusters.
Sorry, you got a little quiet at the end.
I said there is no caps or anything for like cluster scope config, right? It's just like location of a config map somewhere in some namespace or copy it everywhere.
I think this could be a cluster scoped config map or something a little more specific to CA certificates. Should I add help wanted?
Sure, help is always wanted.
When I think of help wanted, I'm like, who's going to want to work on this?
Yeah, well, we'll give it a shot. Already waiting more evidence. Yeah, I think that might be it.
That reminds me, just related to issues and stuff. I saw that PR recently about adding metrics for all the auth success, auth failure, auth error.
Yeah.
Don't even have any opinions on those. I can't see what the value of auth success is. Like, that should happen like hundreds to thousands of times a second, maybe on like a really busy cluster.
I mean, so I looked at that and I saw a, let me see if I can pull up the issue, metrics. We already have a metric for that. So the success is probably duplicated with this metric, the authenticated user requests, counter of user requests broken down by username. So I think it's useful to know how many 401s versus successful authentications are happening, just so that you can have a total count of like success, failure, or not authenticated, and errors. So you can start to draw up error percentages. I think that's where that's pretty useful.
Failure and error seem useful to me. Like, even if you just want to know, like, if someone's trying to like force passwords, right? Like, if you just see an enormous amount of not okay, I don't think a human being is not doing that anymore. Right? It's probably something a little more malicious.
Yeah, but you want to calculate that threshold relative to successes or overall. So unless you can, yeah, I think successes or the sum of all authentications provides the baseline, so you can actually start to make sense of those numbers. I think this is like the first of, it's the low-hanging fruit of a bunch of other stuff I would like to see monitored, such as the same metrics for individual authenticators and overall latency. But I don't think that there's too much of a drawback to adding these metrics, other than they're hard to remove. So they should be sane when we decide to add them. Do you see a downside to adding potentially not useful immediately metrics, Mo?
No, I don't. Like, I can only assume that the Prometheus stuff has to be highly performant for us to use it really at all. And like, it is in the the main part of the call stack for every request. It should be fine, right? Like,
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the actual numbers. but hopefully it's fine.
I mean, it kind of has to be, right? Like the places you would want to use it sort of demand it to be.
Yeah.
Like when I looked at the PR, I was like, I mean, you could just all like, you could like spawn a Go routine. I don't want to spawn another Go routine for every request just to go increment and count.
Yeah. I think it should be pretty fast.
If we're talking about sort of the fallout from the audit and stuff, I did see I think it was your suggestion to deprecate ABAC.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, probably we'll push for that.
Security. So this one was about us using JSON-L for ABAC configuration. The format is prone to human error, is the conclusion of the and then the recommendation is that we use a standard format for ABAC configuration. At what point should we deprecate ABAC?
I mean, is there anything that ABAC lets you do that you can just do with a webhook?
Webhook or RBAC at this point?
Yeah.
Also, the other thing that was potentially relevant to the SIG is we did deprecate RBAC, or deprecate basic auth due to a finding of the trail of bits audit. So there is now precedence for deprecating features that are legacy. So that might be something to consider. I guess we could follow up with an email to the mailing list to ask if anybody's still using it.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that concludes our agenda. So I don't want to linger any longer. Is there anything else that anybody wanted to talk about? Cool. Then let's call it early, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks. Thank you, Erica, for that update.
Thanks for the update, Erica.
Thanks, Al.